time Bauer said those 7 words, everything changed, and not in the way anyone expected. Because this was never just about Meghan, it was about something far deeper, far quieter, and far more explosive. Something that Harry himself may have never fully understood until it was already too late.
Nothing else would invade their own privacy every hour of the day. And I do think the use of the children is quite reprehensible.
Well,
And Harry introducing his children to England. It ain't going to be like that. And there's a long way to go before...
Our dream girl, happy 5th birthday, Lily, the As Ever founder captioned her post alongside a white heart emoji.
Lilibet Diana Mountbatten Windsor, more specifically her name, is already making headlines. With conflict...
But the monarch and King Charles has only met Lily once, who is named after Queen Elizabeth's childhood nickname, seemingly against her chagrin.
That line, "I don't mind, Harry, it's Meghan I'm after," it didn't just land, it detonated. The studio froze, the hosts scrambled, the internet ignited, but behind all that noise, something else was happening. Something that wasn't said out loud. Because Bauer wasn't pointing at Meghan anymore, he was pointing through her toward a story that had already shifted focus to someone else entirely. A child, a name, a detail so small, so delicate, that almost nobody questioned it at first, and that's exactly why it worked. Lilibet, not just a name, not just a tribute, not just a sentimental choice whispered into the world like a soft echo of royalty. No, this was something else, something calculated, something placed with precision, because the moment that name was announced, something didn't sit right behind palace walls. Not publicly, never publicly, but privately, the reaction wasn't warmth, it wasn't nostalgia, it was shock, then confusion, and then suspicion.
More than 30 years since the media baron Robert Maxwell fell to his death off the back of his yacht, Lady Ghislaine.
Because that name wasn't just any name, it was protected, guarded, reserved for a lifetime, and suddenly it was being used in a way no one had ever seen before. But here's where it starts to twist. Because while the public saw emotion, insiders saw timing. Think about it. Step back for just a second and connect the dots the way Bauer did. The timeline doesn't just unfold, it clashes. You have a couple who had just spent months, years even, pulling away from the monarchy, speaking out, stepping back, drawing a clear line between themselves and the institution. And then, at the exact moment that distance became their identity, they reached back and chose the most intimate symbol of that very institution.
It's known for his unauthorized biographies, including the recently re-released publication about one of Britain's most controversial.
That's not coincidence, that's strategy. And Bauer saw it immediately, because by the time he sat down in that studio, the work was already done. The sources, the documents, the contradictions, they weren't theories anymore. They were patterns. Patterns that kept repeating over and over again in ways that didn't match the story being told publicly. And here's where things get uncomfortable, because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. The name, the timing, the messaging, all moving in perfect sync with the narrative that needed emotional weight, needed connection, needed something powerful enough to hold attention while everything else was being questioned. And then comes the silence. That heavy, deliberate silence. No immediate correction. No clear clarification. No unified version of events that shut everything down. Just 2 completely different accounts floating in public, colliding in real time, and instead of resolution, there was distance. Distance that didn't feel accidental. Because when 2 sides tell 2 completely different versions of the same moment, one of them knows something the other doesn't, and Bauer knew exactly where to look. The internet split instantly, as it always does. One side defending, the other dissecting, both completely missing the deeper shift that had already taken place. Because this was no longer about public opinion. It was about something quieter, something harder to challenge, something built on consistency, or the lack of it. And that's where the real story starts to tighten. Because once the name was out there, once the narrative was locked in, everything that followed began to feel choreographed. Appearances, moments, carefully framed glimpses into a life that seemed spontaneous on the surface, but carried a very specific rhythm underneath. Nothing random, nothing accidental. Every move feeding into something larger. Something that, according to Bauer, wasn't just unfolding in real time. It had already been mapped out long before anyone realized what they were looking at. And the most unsettling part? The person closest to it, the one standing right in the center of it all, may not have seen the full picture until the pieces were already locked in place. Because this wasn't about one decision. It was about a sequence. A sequence that kept building, quietly, methodically, until it reached a point where questioning it didn't just feel uncomfortable, it felt almost impossible. And this is where the story stops being about what was said and starts becoming about what was never explained. Because once that pattern locks in, once the sequence begins to repeat itself with that kind of precision, every new moment doesn't stand alone anymore, it becomes evidence. The Jubilee appearance, the photographs, the carefully timed re-entry into a space they had publicly walked away from, it all looked warm on the surface, almost cinematic, like a reconciliation playing out in real time. But underneath that image, insiders weren't describing warmth, they were describing calculation. Because the timing wasn't random, it was perfect. Maximum visibility, maximum emotional impact. And right at the center of it all, the same name that had already raised questions. Then everything accelerated. The meeting with the Queen, captured, documented, distributed globally, and then just months later, those images transformed into something else entirely. Not just a moment, but a final moment. The last visual connection, controlled, framed, and held by the very people who had stepped away. And suddenly, what looked like a simple visit started to feel like something far more strategic when viewed through the same lens Bauer had already applied. And then came the shift in titles. Quiet. Almost silent, no dramatic announcement, no emotional speech, no amplification, just acceptance. Clean, simple, unchallenged acceptance of something that had previously been positioned as deeply significant, even controversial. And that contrast, that gap between the volume of the earlier complaints and the near silence of the resolution, it didn't go unnoticed, because patterns don't just appear once, they repeat. And when they repeat, they start to tell their own story. Then the christening happens, and this is where the contradictions stop being subtle, because everything about it moves in the opposite direction of what the public narrative had conditioned people to expect. No historic setting, no institutional presence, no visible connection to the very structure that had just conferred status. Instead, distance, privacy, separation, and on its own, that decision is completely understandable. But placed inside the sequence that Bauer had already outlined, it doesn't exist on its own anymore. It becomes another piece of the same structure, a structure built on one consistent logic. Take what strengthens the narrative, step away from what demands participation, and repeat. That's the part that doesn't get said out loud, but once you see it, it sits there, impossible to ignore. Because this isn't about one choice or even one moment. It's about alignment. Every decision aligning with a version of events that needed to remain intact, needed to remain emotionally compelling, even when the details behind it started to shift. And then comes the silence again. But this time, it's louder, because by the time Bauer's work is out there, by the time those sequences are laid out side by side, the expectation isn't just reaction, it's correction, it's clarification, it's pushback. And instead, there's nothing, not the kind of nothing that comes from ignoring noise, but the kind that comes from calculation. Because responding opens doors, it invites scrutiny, it forces details into the light that may not fit as neatly as the narrative requires. So the silence holds, and that silence doesn't just come from one side, it comes from both, which is where things become even more unsettling. Because when two opposing sides, both with every reason to defend themselves, both with access to resources, platforms, legal tools, when both choose not to engage, not to escalate, not to dismantle what's been presented, it creates a vacuum. And that vacuum doesn't kill the story, it feeds it. Because now the question isn't what's true. The question is why no one is willing to say otherwise. And that's where the story circles back to the beginning. Not to the interview, not to the headlines, but to that single detail that started everything. A name that was never meant to be public in the first place, suddenly sitting at the center of a narrative that refuses to settle, refuses to resolve, and keeps pulling everything back toward it. Because this was never just about Meghan, and it was never just about Harry. It was about what happens when a story is built so carefully that even the smallest detail carries weight, and what happens when someone comes along and starts connecting those details in a way that can't be easily undone.